National Electrical Code Section 210.52 co-mandates that receptacles be installed in wall spaces that are within 2 feet of the floor and spaced no more than 12 feet apart. When dealing with a kitchen remodel that incorporates a chimney, the question arises whether that chimney constitutes wall space, particularly if countertops are installed on either side of it. Generally, under National Electrical Code Article 100, a chimney isn't automatically considered wall space. However, the inclusion of countertops adjacent to the chimney can create a functional area that an inspector might interpret as requiring a receptacle. It is important to understand that electrical inspectors can and often do have varying interpretations of this role, shaped by their individual judgment and the specifics of the installation. Their decisions are influenced by several key factors. Firstly, accessibility. The inspector will consider how easily accessible the chimney is for plugging in appliances or other devices. If access is significantly hindered, they may be less inclined to require a receptacle. Secondly, safety is a major concern. The inspector evaluates whether the presence of a receptacle on the chimney could introduce a potential hazard, such as increasing the risk of tripping or electrical shock. Thirdly, aesthetics plays a role. Inspectors sometimes weigh the visual impact of adding a receptacle to the chimney, assessing if it would detract from the overall appearance of the kitchen. For electrical contractors, navigating these interpretations requires a proactive approach. Firstly, it's advisable to discuss the situation directly with the electrical inspector. Explain the specifics of the chimney's location, the presence of countertops, and seek their explicit opinion on whether a receptacle is needed. Secondly, provide a well-reasoned rationale if you believe a receptacle is unnecessary. Explain why, perhaps due to limited accessibility of the chimney itself or the aesthetic considerations, it would be impractical or visually disruptive to install one. Thirdly, if the inspector insists on a receptacle, explore alternative locations. Consider installing it in a less conspicuous spot, such as behind the countertop, inside an adjacent appliance cabinet, or on a side wall that's less prominent. By addressing these points, electrical contractors can minimize potential conflicts with inspectors and ensure compliance with the National Electrical Code while considering the functionality and aesthetics of the kitchen design. Now let's look at a more detailed breakdown of the code and factors influencing its interpretation. National Electrical Code Section 210.52 code is very specific, focusing on providing convenient access to receptacles in kitchen and dining areas. The intent is to ensure that homeowners don't have to rely on extension cords, which can be a safety hazard and inconvenience. The rule states that receptacles should be installed so that no point along the wall line is more than 24 inches or 2 feet from a receptacle. This requirement applies to wall spaces that are 12 inches or more in width. A critical point to consider is the definition of wall space. The code doesn't explicitly define wall space in relation to architectural features like chimneys, leaving it open to interpretation. This is where the inspector's judgment becomes significant. When a chimney is present without adjacent countertops, it's typically not considered wall space because it doesn't function as a typical area for placing appliances. However, when countertops are installed on either side of the chimney, the area transforms into a potential workspace. In this scenario, an inspector might argue that the chimney now forms part of a continuous countertop surface, thus requiring a receptacle to comply with 210.52 code. Another important factor is the accessibility of the chimney. If the chimney is enclosed or difficult to reach, an inspector might be more lenient in waiving the receptacle requirement. For instance, if the countertop extends over the chimney, making it hard to access the wall behind it, the inspector may consider the area unsuitable for appliance use. Safety is always a primary concern for electrical inspectors. They evaluate whether installing a receptacle on the chimney could introduce hazards. If the chimney has uneven surfaces or protrusions, installing a receptacle might create a tripping hazard or expose the receptacle to physical damage. Additionally, if the chimney is made of a conductive material like brick, there may be concerns about grounding and insulation to prevent electrical shock. Aesthetic considerations can also play a surprising role in the decision. Inspectors often recognize that strict adherence to the code can sometimes lead to visually unappealing outcomes. If placing a receptacle on the chimney would significantly detract from the kitchen's design, an inspector might be willing to grant a waiver, especially if alternative receptacle locations are available nearby. In such cases, the inspector might prioritize the overall aesthetic appeal while ensuring that the kitchen still meets the general intent of the code regarding convenient receptacle access. As an electrical contractor, it's essential to approach these situations with a clear understanding of the code and a willingness to communicate with the inspector. Before starting the job, reviewing the kitchen layout with the inspector can prevent misunderstandings and costly rework. During this discussion, explain your interpretation of the code and why you believe a receptacle on the chimney is either necessary or not. Providing a logical and well-supported rationale can increase the chances of reaching a mutually agreeable solution. For example, if you propose an alternative receptacle location that provides adequate coverage for the countertop area, the inspector might be more receptive to waiving the requirement on the chimney. If the inspector ultimately requires a receptacle on the chimney, explore discrete installation options. One possibility is to install the receptacle on the side of the chimney that faces the countertop, making it easily accessible but less visible from the main part of the kitchen. Another option is to integrate the receptacle into the backsplash or underside of the countertop, minimizing its impact on the chimney's appearance. In some cases, it might be feasible to run the wiring inside the chimney itself, concealing the receptacle and wiring for a cleaner look. However, this approach requires careful planning and may not be possible depending on the chimney's construction. Remember that documentation is crucial. Keep a record of all communication with the inspector, including any agreements or waivers. This documentation can be valuable if questions arise later during the inspection process or if there are changes in personnel. By staying informed, communicating effectively, and being flexible in your approach, you can navigate the complexities of National Electrical Code 210.52 and ensure a successful kitchen remodel that meets both safety and aesthetic requirements. Considering these points in advance will reduce conflict and produce a well-executed design.